So in Perek Lulav HaGazul, Sukkah Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, we're discussing the issue of Gzela as it pertains to a Lulav HaGazul, a stolen Lulav, and to the principle of Mitzvah Bo B'Avera. And the Gemara says that based on Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's drasha from a Poskim Malachi of Vesim Gazul Vesapiseach, the equation between Gazul and Piseach here on the top of Daf Lamed, Ma Piseach Lesle Takanta, Af Gazul Lesle Takanta. And this introduces the sugya of Yeush. If a person steals something and the nigzal is misyayish, then the gazlan acquires ownership over the object. That's called a kinyan gzela of yeush. In the case of a lulav agazul, assuming that the nigzal was misyayish, the gazlan therefore acquires full-fledged ownership over the lulav. Certainly there's no disqualification of lachem, of the lack of bailus, because now the gazlan is a full-fledged bailam over the lulav. But the issue would be as far as mitzvah bo b'avera. So even though he has lachem, because he was kona the gzela b'yeush, nevertheless, he has a problem that he acquired the lulav through a gzela, through an avera. And the question is, does the psul of mitzvah bo b'avera continue even beyond yeush? And that's what we're going to derive from the equation between piseach and gazul. Piseach, of course, is a psul of mum, and it's a mum she'eno over. It's a permanent injury to the animal, which disqualifies it from Korban Pesach in this case, or for that matter, other Korbanos as well. That's irreversible. And now we're saying that the psul of Gazul is also irreversible. And that's by virtue of the equation between Pesach and Gazul. But how can you tell me that the psul of Gazul is irreversible when he can acquire ownership after Yeush? And therefore there's no longer a disqualification mitzad lachem. And the answer must be that there's a psul here called mitzvah bo b'avera, and that psul applies even after Yeush. So even after the gazlan acquires full ownership over the lulav by virtue of the combination of gzela and Yeush, nevertheless, it's pasul of mitzvah because of mitzvah bo b'avera. Now, what I'd like to take a look at, we started, I believe, last time, and I'm assuming you have the notes of the Masifta. Is that a fair assumption? Yeah. So we started last time with footnote number Vav, and we even began, I think, footnote number Zayin. And we're discussing a scenario in which we know for sure that the nigzal was misyayish. We actually heard him say, "Vayli l'chisaron kis." And there's an issue now about being magdish, the animal that's gazul. In order to be magdish an animal, you have to be the owner of the animal. If Yesh has not taken place, the Gazlan can't be Magdish the animal because he's not the owner of the animal. The Nigzal still owns the animal. And this halacha that ownership is a prerequisite of the Maisa Agdosh is derived from the Pasuk Ishki Yagdish is Beiso. And the Gemara darshins in Bava Kama Daf Samaches that just like Beiso is Shalo, it's his bias, says Beiso in the Torah. And then Ki Yagdish, then he could be Magdish his bias, but he cannot be Magdish something that belongs to someone else, because it's not Beiso. And if you look in our Gemara, the Gemara says that before Yeush, the stolen animal cannot be subject to Hakdosha because of the pasuk Adam ki Yaakov mikem. So Tosfos wants to raise the following question: why do we need both mikem and beso? They seem to be repeating the exact same requirement, the prerequisite of ownership, in order to be magdish an animal or any object. And Tosfos writes here that ain't tzarech l'droshas mikem. I don't need the pasuk mikem that's quoted here in our sugya, because if there was no Yeush Bailim, then the Gzela doesn't belong to the Gazlan. And we could exclude that Hakdosha based on the pasuk Besa. I don't need the word mikem. If you see that inside, he says, Ein tzarech l'drosas mikem, on the fourth line of number Zion. Shebehema gzula shekdisha gazlan kodem Yeush Bailim, psula lakrova, shari ein efshos lahakr behema she'ena kedosha klal. Right, you can't be magdish, and you can't bring an animal on the mizbeach unless it was hakdosha. And we cannot be magdish an animal if it's not beso, if he doesn't own the animal. So if it's gzela before Yeush, clearly there's no possibility of bringing that behema as a korban. Kavanas HaGemara Lomar, however, what the Gemara has intention in teaching us, she'ilmolei hayinu lomdim in apasuk beso, if we didn't have the pasuk beso, teaching me that the Gazlan can't be magdish the animal before Yeush, then we would have derived the same conclusion from the word mikem, that a Gazlan cannot be makriv b'hem gzula before Yeush because it's not his, he doesn't own it, it's not mikem. And the pasuk says, Ish ki yakriv mikem, Adam ki yakriv mikem karbal Hashem. Achein, however, on the last line, on the right column, Achar shalomdu var min haposuk beso she'ena gazan yochel akdisha klal no sar haposuk mikem lidrosh acheres. Now, although it's true that in the absence of the drosh of beso, we could have derived from mikem the conclusion that a gazan cannot be magdish a stolen animal before Yeush. But now that we have the posuk beso, we don't need mikem. And therefore, the word mikem is going to be free, so to speak, superfluous for another drasha. And that's going to tell me that even in a case of a gzeil of an animal and after Yeush, nevertheless, he cannot bring that behema on the mizbeach. Now let's take a look at number Ches. He says, after Yeush, the Gazan is kona the animal and it's his, and yet there's a psul in Lulav HaGazel even after Yeush, not because of Lachem, but rather because of Mitzvah Boba Vera. And this premise or principle that there's no chisaron of lachem after Yeush, which means that a gazla is kona before Yeush, that reflects the view of Reish Lakish and other Amoraim in Masechet Bava Kama Samach Vav. Shal yidei Yeush bailim nikne hachefetz hagazul agazla. So the Kinyan Yeush on the part of a Gazlan is accepted by an entire slew, a group of Amoraim in Masechet Bava Kama. And Rabbi Yochanan here in our sugya reflects that very same shita, that there's no deficiency in bailus over the lulav because the bailam the nigzal was misyayish, and he was therefore the gazlan was kona the chayfetz hagazl, and that forces us to introduce a different psul in the case of lulav gazal yachar yesh bailam, and that's mitzvah bava ver. However, there's a group of Rishonim, Chachmei Sfarad, a large group of Rishonim, and it seems that that's also the view of Tosfos, the Ramaskal Ha, that a Gazlan is not Kona the Gzela with Yeush. Yeush is not sufficient to generate a Kinyan Gzela. And that's the opinion of Yosef and Bava Kama. And Rabbi Yochanan here could accept that opinion of Yosef. But yet the Gemara says beferish here, Hakanya b'yeish. Right? Let's underline those words, Hakanya b'yeish. It's about 8 lines down from the top of the Yomi. So what we're going to have to say is the following: that if Rabbi Yochanan accepts the opinion of Yosef, that a Gazlan is not Konal Yidei Yeush, when it says here, Ha Kanya b'Yeush, that's only reflecting the sheet of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, which is quoted by Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan never accepted that sheet. He quoted that sheet to the name of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, but he never accepted it. And Rabbi Yochanan, Lishitaso, he holds that ein hagazlan kone es hagzela al yidei yesh. So whereas Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is of the opinion that yesh is sufficient to generate a kinyan on the chayfetz hagazl on behalf of the gazlan, Rabbi Yochanan holds that Yeush is not sufficient for acquisition of the Chefetz HaGazl by the Gazlan. Okay, now that's, I guess, what you'd call Roman numeral number 1. Now we go on to Tosfos. Tosfos wants to insist that in this case that is addressed by our sugya here, everybody would agree that the Gazlan was Kona, because there's 2 things. There's not only Yeush, but there's also Shinui Hashem. Now, where's the Shini Hashem? When the Gazlan is magdish the animal, so to speak, changes its status, its identity. It's no longer chulin, it's now hegdish. The Gazlan now could be koneh after the Nigzal was misyayish through what's called Shinui Hashem. The Gazlan, in effect, effectuated a change in the very identity of the object that he stole. Before it was chulin, and now it's hegdish. And even if I hold that yesh alone is not enough to effectuate a kinyan on the part of the gazlan, but if there's yesh plus shini Hashem, then the combination thereof certainly generates a kinyan, and the gazlan acquires ownership over the object. And now what we'd like to take a look at is footnote number Yud, towards the bottom of the page. We're going to derive in our sugya the principle of mitzvah baba vera from the pasuk in Malachi, the subject of which is karbanos. But hu adin l'chol mitzvahs. We're going to now extrapolate and generalize to include all mitzvahs. Mitzvah baba vera is a psul. The implication here is that the psul of mitzvah baba vera, having been derived from this pasuk of karbanos, is a psul doraisa. Now, what do we find in Masechet Bava Kama Daf Tzadi Dalet? Here we have a case of Shinui Achefet. It's not Shinui Hashem, like before it was Chulin and now it's Hegdesh, but Shinui Achefet, the actual entity was changed. Gazal Chitim, he had stolen kernels of wheat, Vitachnan, and he did tchina, grinding the wheat. Lashon, now, having taken out the kernels of the wheat, he is ready to add water and do lisha, which is kneading, K with a K. V'yafon, and then he bakes it. He was mafresh challah. And the Gemara says that his mitzvah of hafashas challah is invalid because it's mitzvah baba vera. Because after all, he stole the chita. But once again, we see clearly that the psul of mitzvah baba vera is not limited to karbanos, just like we saw here in lulav. And now it applies even to the mitzvah of challah. Now he writes here, "V'huskiku atosvis lahavi raya me'agozel chitim, kadesh lo nomar sherak korbanos nifsolim in atorah mishum mitzvah baba vera. Ach b'shara mitzvah zeu derabbanan. Al keno chichu she'af b'shara mitzvahs psul mitzvah baba vera." Right, he stole chitim, and he grinded them up. He made basically bread out of them. And it's possible in a Torah. Now, how do we know that if he steals chitim and he makes it into a bread, then that hafrashas challah is a mitzvah baba vera, even on a doraisal level? And the answer is the Gemara brings a pasuk in that case of stealing chitin and making this pastry out of the. Okay. Now you'll notice in the Masifta, in the text on top, that he says, "Lefichach af shabheim niknesal yidei Yeush." Let's say Yeush and Shinui Hashem lagazlan varei shalom, and therefore there's no psul of lekachtem lachem. Ach, nevertheless, it's mitzvah b'avera, and that passes the mitzvah. Ve'eno yotzi yidei chovos. And this is going to explain why lulav hagazel is pasul kol shiva, right? You remember that at the beginning of the Gemara says kapasuk v'tani loshna v'yantiv rishon, loshna v'yantiv sheni, bishlem yovesh, fine, hadar bina v'leka hagazel, bishlem yantiv rishon, lachem mishalachem, el yantiv sheni amai lo. And the answer is mitzvah baba vera. And mitzvah baba ver carries me through the entire balance of the holiday of Sukkot. So he writes, "V'zeu atam shalulav gazel pasul v'yein litlo afilu b'shar yemei achag af shalom nemar b'hem lachem." The requirement of ownership is not relevant to the balance of the chag, but nevertheless, you have a psul of what? Of mitzvah haba b'avera. So again, if I were to test you and ask you what is the source for the principle from which we derive the principle of mitzvah b'avera, your answer would be malach. And now the Gemara is going to study Yeshayahu Navi and see if we could derive from Yeshayahu the same principle of mitzvah b'avera. Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rav Shimon bar Yochai, my dechsiv. What is the pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi? Perek Samach Aleph. Ki ani Hashem ohev mishpat v'sonei gezel. The Ola. Now, what's the difficulty in this pasuk? The pasuk emphasizes Ola, a carbon Ola. And the Navi is expressing in the name of the Almighty a repulsion, like he's disgusted by Gezel, but only in an Ola? Why only in an Ola? But rather, Sone Gezel, Afilu Mekrivu Lefan of the carbon Ola. The Chiddush is that even Ola, if it was a stolen animal, cannot be used on the Mizbeach. Ma Chidush HaMiyuchad. Shafil Ba'ola Sone Hashem. Why did the pasuk have to go out of its way to say that Sone Gezel be Ola, even Ola? And Rav Shimon bar Yochai responds with a mashal. Mashal melech asav adam shaya over al beis hameches. So this is where they collect the taxes. Amar lavadav, he tells his servants, the king commissions them tnu meches lamochse. Amrulo. Why is the king telling his servants to bring to bring payment of taxes, it's like going from one hand to the other. I mean, all the taxes go to the king's treasury anyway. This is going to be a sample, so to speak, a model for all those not to cheat in their taxes. Even the king himself gives taxes. So what's the nimshal? Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Omar, God declares, Ani Hashem sonei gezel bi'olah. And mimenu yilmedu banai v'yavrichu atzma min hagezel. In other words, Ola is kulo kolil, completely goes to Shamayim. And Hashem says, I hate gezel bi'olah, even though you're giving me the entire animal for me for a korban olah. I don't want to have anything to do with this korban olah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sonei gezel bi'olah, and not only in olah, as we said before, but it applies to all mitzvahs. God is sonei gezel. I mean, please note that both Yalfusas, the Lishna Kama from Malachi and the Lishna Basra from Yeshaya, are focused on Karbanos. But we know that Mitzvah B'Avera extends beyond the domain of Karbanos. Now, we see that Mitzvah B'Avera applies to all mitzvahs, but I'm not sure how we know this. Do you see anything on this? Because I was looking at footnote number Yud. Anybody help me out over here? How do we know the Mitzvah B'Avera applies beyond the realm of Karbanos? can't figure out. So again, the language of Tosfos is this is the fourth line down in the top Tosfos on Daf Lamed Omanal. Afagav de Kragabi Karbon Ksiv, who had din b'chol mitzvahs. Question is, how do we know such a thing? As the Gemara knows such a thing. So I'm going to take a look here just by chance in a million. Maybe he adds something here in the Bi'urei Tosfos. It's on page Lamed Vav in the Bi'urei Tosfos. I don't know. I'm not finding it. I mean, again, I'm not questioning the fact that the psul of mitzvah b'avera is applicable even beyond the realm of karbanos, like in lulav and in challah. But how do we know such a thing? That I don't find a satisfactory answer. Okay, now we go on. So let's take a look for a moment at footnote number Yud Beis. Hatam shehutzucha Gemara lahavi makar nosaf. Why isn't it enough to derive it from Malachi? Why do we need Yeshayahu? Mishum she'im hayinu lomdim me'amok harishon levado, hayamokum lom shemitzah ba baver psulo dafka b'mitzvah sheyesh b'hem hana li adam. Higon karbonos sheyesh lehem achila, whether it's the Bailam or the Kohen. L'kach mevia gemara mokar sheni shebo yivuim kol ben ola, where there's no hana. So in the case of lulav, like the case of a korban ola, there's no hana li adam. So if a person through an avera gets hana, then that's very, that's very objectionable, and therefore it's possible midin mitzvah avera. But in the case of a lulav, he's not getting any hana from it. In the case of ola, he's not getting any hana from it. Therefore, I might think that the Torah is more lenient and would not passel the mitzvah avera. I'm wondering if there's some deeper meaning here to this Tosus. Okay. Itmar Nami, Omer Avi Ami, Yovesh Posul, Mipnei She'ein Hadar. Lulav Gozul Posul, Mishum Dehavi Le Mitzvah Bavavir. Upliga de Rabbi Yitzchak. So this is against Rabbi Yitzchak. Tiom Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmeni, Omer Shmuel, Lo Shanu El V'Yontif Rishon. Al V'Yontif Sheni, Mitoch Sheyotze B'Shaul, Yotze Nami B'Gozul. So Rabbi Yitzchak rejects mitzvah baba vera, and he allows you to take the lulav that's stolen, but not on the first day, because then you don't have bailus and chisaron and lochem. But during the balance of sukkahs, he's okay. And why is he okay? Because the balance of sukkahs, he doesn't need lachem. So even though it's stolen and it's not his, he could be yotze. What about mitzvah baba vera? And that's what it says over here. Mitoshi yotze b'shol, even though it's not his, but there's no requirement to lachem, is yotze nami b'gozel, even though it's not his. So that we see clearly that Rabbi Yitzchak does not accept mitzvah baba vera. Yeah, I'm tempted to think that maybe Rabbi Yitzchak got stuck with our question as well. Meaning mitzvah baba avera is derived in two places from karbonos, and maybe he's not willing to extrapolate from karbonos as a binyanav for all mitzvahs. And therefore lulav hagozl is kosher, as long as it's lachem, or there's no requirement of lachem. So we're up to Masiv Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. The Mishnah says, Lulav hagozl v'yovesh pasul. And from the fact that the Mishnah isolates Guzzle, implying that shol would be no problem. Hashol kosher. Ema sile miyontev frishon aksiv lachem. Mishal lachem. I love Dideu, it's not his. Elolav, we have no choice but to assume it's Yontiv Sheni. In other words, the balance of Sukkahs where there's no requirement to lachem. Uktani, and nevertheless, it says in the Mishnah, Lulav HaGazel Pasel. So we see clearly that Lulav HaGazel is Pasel even in Shar Yemei Achag. So how could Rabbi Yitzchak question the principle of Mitzvah Baba Avera? Amar Rava Liola B'Yontif Rishon. Lomi boy come. Lomi boy Shaul Delav Dideu. Avol Gozel Amos Tam Gzel Yesh Bailemu Kidi De Domi Kamash Malon. Af shenigzal achefetz mi b'fnei bailim ein lo leniach shemin hastam es yayish ad shelo shamanu ken mifiv mefurash. Eino menichim shenigzal omer af sheka'es hagazlon chazak mimeni ve'eni yochol limnoa mimeni legozlani ach bi osid et ba'o solid bezdin ve'hem yotziu mimeno tagzela. So therefore, there's a whole psychological reason why he's not Messiahish. And if there's no Yesh Bailim, then he's not Kona Lulav, it's not his, and he cannot fulfill his obligation on the first day of Sukkot, where the Torah says, L'katem lochem, mishal lochem. Okay, then. I think we'll stop a little early. And hopefully, are you gentlemen available for Sanhedrin at about 10:45? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.